The autumn air was crisp in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, on that Tuesday evening in September 1967. Robert Mitchell had been driving the same route home from his insurance office for nearly 8 years. He knew every curve of Highway 30, every farmhouse, and every cornfield that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. But what he saw that night would change his life forever. Robert was a simple man who lived by simple rules. He went to work every morning at 8, came home every evening at 6, and spent his weekends watching television with his wife Martha and their 2 young children. He never drank more than 1 beer with dinner and never missed church on Sunday. People in Cedar Rapids knew Robert as a reliable man who minded his own business and told the truth. That Tuesday started like any other day. Robert had spent the afternoon processing insurance claims and meeting with clients who needed coverage for their farms and businesses. The work was routine but steady, and Robert took pride in helping his neighbors protect what mattered most to them. As the sun began to set, he packed his briefcase, said goodbye to his secretary Helen, and walked to his blue Ford sedan in the parking lot. The drive home usually took 25 minutes. Robert would listen to the evening news on the radio and think about what Martha might be cooking for dinner. Sometimes he would stop at the grocery store if she had asked him to pick up milk or bread. But on this particular evening, something unusual caught his attention about halfway home. As Robert drove past the Henderson farm, he noticed a bright light in the sky above the cornfield. At first he thought it might be a plane flying unusually low. But as he slowed his car and looked more carefully, he realized the light was not moving like any aircraft he had ever seen. The object was perfectly round and glowed with a soft, white light that seemed to pulse gently. It hovered silently about 50 feet above the tall corn stalks. Robert pulled his car to the side of the road and rolled down his window. The evening air was still and quiet, except for the distant sound of crickets. The object continued to hover without making any noise at all. Robert had never seen anything like it in his 34 years of life. He watched in amazement as the craft slowly descended toward the cornfield. The object touched down gently, in a small clearing between the corn rows. Robert could see it clearly now. It was about 30 feet across and shaped like a disc, with a slightly raised center. The surface appeared to be metallic and reflected the last rays of sunlight. Small lights blinked around the edge in a pattern that reminded Robert of Christmas decorations. For several minutes, nothing happened. Robert sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, and wondering if he should drive away or get closer. His practical mind told him to leave immediately, but his curiosity kept him frozen in place. He had read stories in magazines about flying saucers, but he had never believed them. Now he was seeing one with his own eyes. Suddenly, a door or opening appeared on the side of the craft. Robert had not seen it open, but there was definitely an entrance where the smooth surface had been moments before. A figure emerged from the craft and stood in the cornfield. The being was humanoid in shape but appeared taller and thinner than a normal person. In the fading light, Robert could not make out many details, but he could see that the figure was examining something in its hands, possibly taking measurements or samples. After about 10 minutes, the figure returned to the craft and the opening closed seamlessly. The disc began to glow brighter and slowly rose into the air. It hovered for a moment above the cornfield, then shot upward at incredible speed until it disappeared into the darkening sky. The entire encounter had lasted less than half an hour, but Robert knew his life would never be the same. When Robert arrived home that evening, Martha immediately noticed that something was wrong. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he sat down at the kitchen table. Martha asked if he was feeling sick, but Robert just stared at his dinner plate without eating. Finally, he told her what he had seen. Martha listened quietly as Robert described the craft and the strange figure. She had been married to Robert for 12 years and had never known him to lie or make up stories. If Robert said he saw a flying saucer, then she believed he had seen something unusual. She suggested that he report it to the police, but Robert was reluctant. He worried that people would think he was crazy. The next morning, Robert decided to drive back to the Henderson farm to look for evidence of the landing. He found the cornfield easily enough, but when he walked into the area where he had seen the craft touch down, there was nothing unusual. The cornstalk stood tall and undisturbed. There were no burn marks or impressions in the soil. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Despite the lack of physical evidence, Robert could not forget what he had witnessed. That evening, he called the Cedar Rapids Police Department and spoke to Officer Tom Bradley. Robert explained what he had seen and asked if anyone else had reported similar sightings. Officer Bradley was polite but clearly skeptical. He took down Robert's information and promised to file a report, though he suggested that Robert might have seen a weather balloon or experimental aircraft. 3 days after the sighting, Robert was eating breakfast when Martha called him to the front door. 2 men in dark suits were standing on his porch. They introduced themselves as Agent Davis and Agent Thompson and said they were from a government agency investigating unusual aerial phenomena. The men were tall and thin with pale skin and dark hair. They wore identical black suits, white shirts, and narrow black ties. Their shoes were so perfectly polished that they reflected the morning sunlight. Agent Davis did most of the talking while Agent Thompson took notes in a small black notebook. Their voices were flat and emotionless, and they spoke in a formal manner that seemed outdated. They asked Robert to describe exactly what he had seen on Tuesday evening. As Robert answered their questions, he noticed that the men already seemed to know many details about his sighting before he told them. After 20 minutes of questions, Agent Davis closed his notebook and looked directly at Robert. His eyes were unusually pale blue, almost colorless. He explained that what Robert had witnessed was part of a classified military test, and that discussing it with anyone could compromise national security. Agent Thompson handed Robert a business card with only a phone number printed on it and told him to call if he remembered any additional details. Before leaving, Agent Davis placed his hand on Robert's shoulder and spoke in a low, measured tone. He said it would be best for everyone if Robert forgot about what he had seen and never spoke of it again. The touch of the man's hand felt unusually cold, even through Robert's shirt. After the men left, Robert stood in his doorway watching their black sedan drive away. Something about the encounter felt wrong, but he could not explain why. The agents had been polite and professional, yet Robert felt more frightened after talking to them than he had while watching the mysterious craft. He went inside and threw their business card in the trash, deciding to follow their advice and never speak of the incident again. Part 2. The pattern emerges. 3 months had passed since Robert Mitchell's encounter in Cedar Rapids when another witness emerged over 1,000 miles away in the Arizona desert. Nancy Brooks had always been fascinated by the night sky. As a registered nurse at Phoenix General Hospital, she worked long shifts that often ended after midnight. Instead of going straight home, Nancy would sometimes drive out to the desert with her telescope and camera to watch the stars. Nancy was 29 years old and lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of Phoenix. She had moved to Arizona from Michigan 5 years earlier, drawn by the clear desert skies that were perfect for astronomy. Her colleagues at the hospital thought her hobby was unusual, but Nancy found peace in the quiet desert nights after dealing with the stress and chaos of her job. On a cold December evening in 1967, Nancy finished her shift at 11:30 and decided to drive to her favorite viewing spot about 20 miles outside the city. The location was a flat area of desert surrounded by low hills far from the lights of Phoenix. She had discovered it during her first year in Arizona and had been coming there regularly ever since. Nancy arrived at the desert location shortly after midnight and began setting up her telescope. The sky was perfectly clear with no clouds or haze. She could see the Milky Way stretching across the heavens like a river of light. Nancy attached her camera to the telescope mount and began taking photographs of star clusters and nebulae that she hoped to develop later in her makeshift darkroom. Around 1:15 in the morning, Nancy noticed something unusual in the southern sky. At first, she thought it might be a satellite or high-altitude aircraft, but the object was moving in a way that defied explanation. It would hover in one spot for several minutes, then dart quickly to another location miles away, then stop again, as if it were searching for something. Nancy adjusted her telescope to get a better look at the mysterious object. Through the lens, she could see that it was not a conventional aircraft. The object appeared to be triangular in shape, with bright, white lights at each corner. The lights would sometimes change color, shifting from white to blue to red and back again. The craft moved completely silently, which Nancy found especially strange given its apparent size and speed. Realizing that she was witnessing something extraordinary, Nancy quickly attached her camera to the telescope and began taking photographs. She managed to capture more than 20 images over the next hour, as the object continued its strange movements across the desert sky. Sometimes it would come closer to her location, allowing her to see more details. The surface of the craft appeared to be dark and smooth, almost like polished stone. At one point, the object hovered directly overhead at what Nancy estimated to be about 500 feet above the ground. She could feel a slight humming sensation, as if the air itself were vibrating. The experience was both thrilling and terrifying. Nancy had always believed that life might exist elsewhere in the universe, but she had never expected to witness it firsthand. After nearly 2 hours of observation, the object suddenly accelerated upward and disappeared into space faster than anything Nancy had ever seen. The entire desert fell silent again except for the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other across the hills. Nancy sat in her folding chair for another 30 minutes, trying to process what she had just experienced. When Nancy returned home that morning, she immediately began developing the photographs in her bathroom darkroom. She had learned photography as a teenager and had maintained the hobby even during her busy nursing career. As the images appeared in the developer solution, Nancy's excitement grew. The photographs clearly showed the triangular craft with its unusual lighting patterns. Nancy decided to contact the local newspaper about her sighting. She called the Phoenix Herald and spoke to a reporter named Mike Collins who covered unusual stories. Mike seemed interested and asked Nancy to bring her photographs to the newspaper office. He told her that the paper had received several reports of strange lights over the desert in recent months, but Nancy's photographs were the first physical evidence they had seen. 2 days after Nancy's story and photographs appeared on the front page of the Phoenix Herald, she received unexpected visitors. Nancy had just returned from her shift at the hospital when she found 2 men in black suits waiting outside her apartment building. They introduced themselves as Agent Wilson and Agent Parker and showed her identification cards from what they claimed was a government research agency. The men were similar in appearance to those who had visited Robert Mitchell in Iowa, though Nancy had no knowledge of Robert's encounter at the time. Agent Wilson was tall and thin with pale skin and dark hair. Agent Parker was slightly shorter but had the same unusual pale complexion. Both men wore identical black suits that appeared to be perfectly tailored. Their shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Agent Wilson explained that they were investigating Nancy's UFO sighting and needed to examine her photographs and equipment. Nancy invited the men into her apartment, though something about them made her feel uncomfortable. They moved stiffly, as if they were not used to normal human movement. Their speech patterns were formal and outdated, using phrases that reminded Nancy of old movies from the 1940s. The agent spent nearly an hour examining Nancy's photographs and asking detailed questions about her sighting. They wanted to know exactly where she had been positioned, what time each photograph was taken, and whether she had told anyone else about the encounter. Nancy noticed that Agent Parker took extensive notes in a small black notebook, similar to the ones used by the agents who had visited Robert Mitchell. When the questioning was finished, Agent Wilson informed Nancy that her photographs showed classified military aircraft and that keeping them would violate national security laws. Nancy protested that she had a right to keep her own photographs, but Agent Parker calmly explained that the materials were now government property. They confiscated not only the photographs but also Nancy's camera, telescope, and all of her darkroom equipment. Before leaving, Agent Wilson handed Nancy a business card with only a phone number printed on it. He told her to call if she remembered any additional details about her sighting. Agent Parker added that it would be wise for Nancy to avoid returning to the desert location where the encounter had occurred. Both men emphasized that discussing the incident with anyone could result in serious legal consequences. After the agents left, Nancy felt confused and angry. The men had been polite but somehow threatening. She tried calling the phone number on their business card but reached only a recorded message saying the number was temporarily out of service. When she contacted the Phoenix Herald to report the confiscation of her evidence, Reporter Mike Collins told her that two similar agents had visited the newspaper office and demanded that the story be retracted. Nancy began researching UFO sightings and discovered a newsletter called Sky Watchers Monthly that collected reports from witnesses across the country. She submitted her story to the newsletter, hoping to connect with other people who had similar experiences. 3 weeks later, she received a letter from Robert Mitchell in Iowa describing his own encounter with mysterious agents in black suits. The similarities between their experiences were striking. Both had witnessed unusual aircraft. Both had been visited by pale men in identical black suits, and both had been warned to remain silent about their encounters. Nancy and Robert began corresponding regularly, sharing details about their experiences and trying to understand what had happened to them. They discovered that the agents who had visited them used similar speech patterns and behaved in nearly identical ways. Through the UFO newsletter, Nancy and Robert connected with other witnesses who reported similar encounters with men in black. A pattern was emerging that suggested these mysterious visitors were more than just government agents investigating unusual sightings. They appeared to be part of a larger operation designed to silence UFO witnesses and confiscate evidence of extraterrestrial encounters. James Parker had served 22 years in the United States Air Force before retiring to a small ranch near Roswell, New Mexico. As a former intelligence officer, James had worked on classified projects that he could never discuss, even with his wife Carol. He had seen many things during his military career that the public would never know about, but nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed on a clear March evening in 1968. James was checking on his cattle around 9 o'clock when he noticed unusual lights moving across the desert sky. The lights were arranged in a perfect formation and moved with precision that reminded him of military aircraft. However, these objects made no sound and moved at speeds that exceeded anything in the Air Force inventory. James watched through his binoculars as the craft performed maneuvers that would have been impossible for any known aircraft. One of the objects separated from the group and descended toward James's property. The craft landed about 200 yards from his house in a pasture where his cattle normally grazed. James noticed that his animals had moved to the far end of the field and appeared agitated. The landed craft was disc-shaped and approximately 40 feet in diameter. Soft blue light emanated from windows or openings around its perimeter. As a trained intelligence officer, James observed the craft methodically and took mental notes of every detail. The surface appeared to be seamless metal with no visible rivets or welding marks. After about 15 minutes, the craft rose silently from the pasture and rejoined the other objects in the sky. The entire formation then accelerated toward the southeast and disappeared beyond the horizon. The next morning, James found a circular area in his pasture where the grass had been flattened in a perfect ring pattern. The soil inside the circle felt warm to the touch and had an unusual oily texture. James collected samples of the affected soil and grass, sealing them in glass jars for later analysis. His military training had taught him the importance of preserving evidence. 3 days after his sighting, James received the now familiar visit from two men in black suits. They identified themselves as Agent Richards and Agent Stone from a government agency that James had never heard of during his military service. The men knew details about James's sighting that he had not reported to anyone. They also seemed to know about his military background and security clearance level. Agent Richards explained that James had witnessed a classified military exercise and that his continued silence was required to protect national security. Agent Stone collected the soil and grass samples that James had gathered, claiming they contained traces of experimental fuel. The men were polite but firm in their instructions that James should not discuss the incident with anyone, including his wife. After the agents left, James felt troubled by the encounter. During his military career, he had worked with many intelligence agencies and knew their standard operating procedures. The behavior of these men did not match any protocol. He recognized their identification cards looked authentic, but something about the agencies they claimed to represent did not seem right. James decided to conduct his own investigation. Using contacts from his military service, he began asking discreet questions about unusual aircraft sightings and visits from mysterious government agents. He learned that similar incidents had been reported at military installations across the Southwest, but official records of these events did not exist. Through his research, James discovered the UFO newsletter that had connected Robert Mitchell and Nancy Brooks. He contacted both witnesses and shared his own experience with the strange visitors. James's military background gave him credibility with other witnesses who had been reluctant to discuss their encounters with civilian researchers. Over the following months, James interviewed dozens of people who claimed to have been visited by men in black after UFO sightings. He traveled throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, documenting cases and looking for patterns. The stories he collected were remarkably consistent in their details about the appearance and behavior of the mysterious agents. In Tucson, Arizona, James met Linda Hayes, a 35-year-old elementary school teacher who had witnessed a UFO landing near her home in January 1968. Linda described how two men in black suits had visited her 3 days later, confiscated photographs she had taken, and warned her not to discuss the incident. The men had known personal details about Linda's life that she had never shared with anyone, including the names of her students and her teaching schedule. Linda told James that the agents had seemed to know she would be home alone when they visited. They arrived exactly 30 minutes after her husband left for work, suggesting they had been watching her house. The men spoke in the same formal, outdated manner that other witnesses had described. They moved stiffly and seemed uncomfortable with normal human interactions. Another witness James interviewed was Mark Johnson, a cattle rancher from Albuquerque, who had seen multiple craft hovering over his property in February 1968. Mark described his visitors as identical to those reported by other witnesses. The agents had confiscated a piece of unusual metal that Mark found after the sighting. When Mark asked for a receipt for the confiscated evidence, the agents told him no receipt was necessary because the incident had never officially occurred. James noticed that all the men in black encounters followed a similar timeline. The mysterious visitors appeared within 3 to 5 days after each UFO sighting, usually during daylight hours when witnesses were alone. They always traveled in pairs and drove black sedans with government license plates. Local police departments had no record of these vehicles or their occupants when witnesses tried to verify their legitimacy. The agents always claimed to represent obscure government agencies that could not be verified through official channels. They possessed detailed knowledge about each witness and their sighting before asking any questions. They confiscated physical evidence without providing proper documentation and issued warnings about national security that seemed designed to frighten rather than inform. James began documenting his findings in a detailed report that he hoped to submit to congressional investigators. He believed that someone was running an unauthorized operation to suppress UFO reports and intimidate witnesses. The precision and consistency of the men in black encounters suggested a well-organized effort with significant resources and access to classified information about UFO witnesses. As James continued his investigation, he noticed that he was being followed by unmarked vehicles. His phone calls were sometimes interrupted by strange clicking sounds that suggested surveillance equipment. Carol became worried about her husband's safety and begged him to abandon his research. She pointed out that whoever was behind the Men in Black operation had already demonstrated their willingness to track and intimidate witnesses. Despite the potential danger, James felt compelled to continue his work. His military oath to protect the Constitution included defending the rights of American citizens to report what they had seen without fear of harassment. He believed that the Men in Black operation represented a threat to those constitutional rights, regardless of whether the UFO sightings were real or misidentified conventional aircraft. James's investigation was expanding beyond simple documentation. He was uncovering evidence of a systematic campaign to silence UFO witnesses through intimidation and the confiscation of evidence. The operation appeared to have unlimited resources and access to personal information about American citizens. Most disturbing of all, no legitimate government agency would acknowledge responsibility for the Men in Black visits. By the end of 1968, James had documented over 50 cases of Men in Black encounters across 4 southwestern states. The pattern was undeniable, but the identity and motivation of the mysterious visitors remained unknown. James realized that he was investigating something far more complex and potentially dangerous than simple UFO sightings. He was uncovering evidence of a shadow organization operating outside the normal channels of government authority. James Parker's investigation had reached a critical point by early 1969. He had documented dozens of men in black encounters and gathered evidence that suggested a coordinated effort to silence UFO witnesses. Now he needed to determine who was responsible for these mysterious visits. James decided to use his military contacts to trace the alleged government agencies that the men in black claimed to represent. James began by contacting Colonel William Hayes, his former commanding officer at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Colonel Hayes had access to classified directories of all government agencies involved in aerospace research and national security. James asked him to verify the existence of the agencies mentioned by the men in black visitors. After 2 weeks of research, Colonel Hayes reported back with disturbing news. None of the government agencies claimed by the men in black actually existed. The identification cards shown to witnesses bore the names of fictional organizations that had no presence in any official government directory. Colonel Hayes had checked with the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, and the National Security Agency. No legitimate agency employed agents matching the descriptions provided by UFO witnesses. James then contacted FBI agent Thomas Reed, who had worked with him on security matters during his Air Force career. Agent Reed agreed to investigate the Men in Black reports through official FBI channels. He submitted requests for information about government agents conducting UFO investigations in the southwestern United States. The response from FBI headquarters was immediate and definitive. No FBI agents were involved in UFO investigations, and no other federal agency had requested FBI assistance with such matters. The CIA response was equally clear. Agent Patricia Moore from the CIA's Office of Security informed James that the agency had no ongoing operations involving UFO witness interviews. She emphasized that any legitimate CIA agents conducting such interviews would have proper documentation and would coordinate with local law enforcement agencies. The mysterious visitors described by witnesses did not match any CIA operational procedures. James's most important contact was Dr. William Foster, a physicist who worked on classified aerospace projects for the Department of Defense. Dr. Foster had security clearance high enough to access information about experimental aircraft programs that might explain some UFO sightings. When James approached him about the Men in Black encounters, Dr. Foster requested a private meeting away from government facilities. They met at a small diner outside Albuquerque on a rainy Thursday evening in March 1969. Dr. Foster looked nervous as he explained what he had learned through his own discreet inquiries. Military installations across the country had reported visits from unauthorized personnel claiming to investigate UFO sightings. Base commanders had been unable to verify the credentials of these visitors, but they had generally cooperated because the men appeared to have legitimate government identification. Dr. Foster revealed that similar mysterious visits had occurred at Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he worked on advanced propulsion research. 2 men in black suits had questioned several scientists about their observations of unusual aerial phenomena near the laboratory. The men had access badges that appeared authentic, but security records showed no authorization for their visit. When laboratory officials tried to contact the agency listed on their identification cards, they discovered that no such organization existed. The pattern extended beyond civilian witnesses to include military personnel and government scientists. Dr. Foster explained that several colleagues at different research facilities had reported encounters with the same type of mysterious visitors. The men always appeared within days of unusual aerial sightings and always followed the same procedure of questioning witnesses and confiscating any physical evidence. James asked Dr. Foster if the visits could be part of a legitimate black project designed to protect classified military aircraft. Dr. Foster shook his head and explained that all military security operations required proper documentation and coordination with base commanders. The men in black operated outside normal security protocols and seemed to have no official oversight or accountability. Most disturbing was Dr. Foster's revelation that the mysterious visitors had access to highly classified information about witness locations and backgrounds. They knew details about military personnel assignments, security clearances, and personal lives that would require high-level intelligence access. Yet no government agency would acknowledge employing these agents or providing them with such sensitive information. James realized that he was dealing with an organization that had infiltrated government databases and was operating with sophisticated intelligence capabilities. The men in black were not simply imposters using fake identification cards. They had access to real government information and resources that suggested connections to legitimate agencies, even though those agencies denied any involvement. The investigation took another troubling turn when James contacted local police departments in areas where men in black encounters had occurred. Sheriff Robert Martinez in Roswell told James that his department had received several complaints about the mysterious visitors, but had been unable to verify their authority or identity. The license plates on their black sedans traced back to a government motor pool, but requests for information about the vehicles were denied by federal authorities citing national security concerns. Detective Susan Clark in Phoenix reported similar frustrations with her investigation of men in black reports. The agents appeared to have legitimate government credentials and drove official vehicles, but no agency would acknowledge responsibility for their activities. When Detective Clark tried to arrest two of the mysterious visitors for harassment of witnesses, her superiors received calls from federal officials ordering her to cease all investigation of the matter. James discovered that the men in black operation had protection from interference by local law enforcement. Someone with significant influence in the federal government was ensuring that the mysterious visitors could continue their activities without hindrance. This protection suggested that the operation, while apparently unauthorized by official agencies, had support from individuals with high-level government positions. The evidence pointed to a shadow organization operating within or parallel to legitimate government agencies. The men in black had access to classified databases, official vehicles, and authentic-looking identification cards. They received protection from federal interference and could operate across state lines without restriction. Yet no agency would acknowledge their existence or take responsibility for their actions. James began to suspect that the men in black might be connected to one of the government's unofficial programs that operated outside normal oversight. During his military career, he had heard rumors about black projects that were so classified that even Congress did not know about them. These programs reportedly had access to unlimited funding and could recruit personnel from various agencies without leaving official records. The possibility that the men in black represented an authorized but highly classified operation raised serious questions about government accountability and constitutional rights. If federal agents were intimidating American citizens to suppress UFO reports, they were violating basic civil liberties regardless of their official status. The secrecy surrounding their activities made it impossible to determine whether their actions were legal or authorized. James's investigation had revealed a disturbing pattern of government denial, combined with apparent official protection for the men in black operation. Legitimate agencies claimed no knowledge of the mysterious visitors, yet those same agencies seemed reluctant to investigate or stop their activities. The contradiction suggested either a massive cover-up or a rogue operation with high-level protection. As James compiled his findings, he realized that he was documenting evidence of what appeared to be an illegal surveillance and intimidation program targeting American citizens. The men in black were using government resources and authority to suppress information about UFO sightings, but they operated without proper oversight or accountability. Whether their activities were authorized by secret executive orders or represented a criminal conspiracy remained unclear. The government's response to James's investigation was consistent denial of responsibility, combined with subtle pressure to abandon his research. Several of his military contacts reported being questioned by superiors about their communications with James. Dr. Foster was reassigned to a different project and told that his security clearance would be reviewed if he continued discussing UFO matters with unauthorized personnel. James realized that his investigation had reached the limits of what he could accomplish through official channels. The government agencies that should have been investigating the men in black were either ignorant of their activities or complicit in their operations. The truth about the mysterious visitors would have to be uncovered through other means, despite the obvious risks to anyone who continued pursuing the matter. The summer of 1969 brought a dangerous new phase to James Parker's investigation. What had begun as a simple documentation of men in black encounters was now revealing a complex web of surveillance, intimidation, and possible criminal activity. James and several other witnesses began experiencing harassment that went far beyond the initial visits from mysterious agents. Robert Mitchell was the first to notice that he was being followed. The insurance salesman from Cedar Rapids had tried to return to his normal life after his encounter with the men in black, but he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. Black sedans with tinted windows appeared regularly in his neighborhood and near his office. When Robert tried to get close enough to see the license plates, the vehicles would drive away before he could read them clearly. The harassment escalated when Robert began receiving strange phone calls at home and at work. The caller would remain silent for several seconds before hanging up. Sometimes Robert could hear background sounds that suggested the calls were being made from a car or mobile location. His wife Martha became frightened when the calls began, coming in the middle of the night, often at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. Nancy Brooks experienced similar surveillance in Phoenix. The nurse noticed unmarked cars parked near her apartment building and outside the hospital where she worked. Her mail delivery became irregular, with some letters arriving days late or not at all. Nancy suspected that someone was intercepting her correspondence, particularly letters from other UFO witnesses she had been communicating with through the Skywatcher's monthly newsletter. The pattern of escalating harassment extended to other witnesses that James had interviewed. Linda Hayes, the schoolteacher from Tucson, reported that strangers had been asking questions about her at the school where she worked. The principal told Linda that 2 men in suits had visited the school office claiming to be conducting a background check for a government job application. Linda had not applied for any government positions. Mark Johnson, the rancher from Albuquerque, discovered that someone had been trespassing on his property at night. He found tire tracks from vehicles that had driven through his pastures in areas where the UFO landing had occurred. Motion sensors he installed around his house were triggered repeatedly, but he never caught sight of the intruders. His cattle became nervous and agitated, clustering together as if sensing danger. James realized that the men in black operation had evolved beyond simple witness intimidation into active surveillance and psychological warfare. Someone was making a deliberate effort to frighten UFO witnesses into complete silence through systematic harassment. The precision and coordination of these activities suggested professional intelligence operatives with extensive resources and training. Betty Coleman, an investigative journalist for the Denver Post, became interested in the Men in Black story after James contacted her newspaper about his findings. Betty had built her career exposing government corruption and was not easily intimidated by official denials. She agreed to investigate the story and began interviewing witnesses and attempting to verify James's research through independent sources. Betty's investigation took an unexpected turn when she discovered financial records that provided clues about the Men in Black operations funding. Through contacts in the banking industry, she learned that several shell companies had been established in Nevada and Delaware, with the apparent purpose of purchasing vehicles and equipment that matched the resources used by the mysterious agents. The shell companies were funded through a complex network of bank transfers that originated from accounts connected to defense contractors and intelligence agencies. Betty traced the money trail through multiple layers of corporations and partnerships, each designed to obscure the original source of funding. The financial structure suggested that someone with access to significant government resources was financing the Men in Black operation. David Walsh, a private investigator from Los Angeles, joined the investigation after his own clients began reporting harassment following UFO sightings. David had worked for insurance companies and law firms for 15 years and had experience tracing fraudulent operations and identifying surveillance techniques. He offered to help James and Betty uncover the true identity of the Men in Black organization. David's investigation focused on the vehicles used by the mysterious agents. He discovered that the black sedans had been purchased through a leasing company that specialized in providing unmarked cars to government agencies. The lease agreements were signed by representatives of corporations that existed only on paper, with no physical offices or legitimate business activities. The license plates on the men in black vehicles were issued through a special program that provided government plates to authorized agencies without creating public records. David learned that someone with high-level clearance had arranged for the plates to be issued to the fictional agencies claimed by the mysterious agents. This discovery proved that the men in black had inside help from legitimate government officials. David also uncovered evidence that the men in black were using sophisticated surveillance equipment that was normally available only to intelligence agencies. Phone tapping devices, electronic tracking systems, and high-resolution cameras were being used to monitor UFO witnesses across multiple states. The cost and complexity of this equipment indicated that the operation had a substantial budget and technical support. The investigation revealed that the men in black operation was not simply a group of imposters using fake identification. They were part of a well-funded organization with access to government resources, classified databases, and professional intelligence operatives. The group appeared to be operating with at least tacit approval from officials within legitimate agencies, even though those agencies publicly denied any involvement. Betty Coleman's attempts to publish her findings met with immediate resistance from unexpected sources. Her editor at the Denver Post received calls from federal officials, warning that the newspaper could face legal consequences if it published stories that might compromise national security. The newspaper's corporate lawyers advised against running the Men in Black investigation, citing potential liability issues. Similar pressure was applied to other news organizations that expressed interest in the story. Television stations and magazines that had initially shown enthusiasm for investigating the Men in Black encounters suddenly withdrew their support after receiving visits from government representatives. The systematic suppression of media coverage suggested that the operation had support from the highest levels of government. James Parker found that his own investigation was being actively hindered by former colleagues in the military and intelligence community. Officers who had previously been willing to help verify information about government agencies now refused to return his calls. His security clearance was formally revoked without explanation, cutting off his access to classified sources of information. The harassment of witnesses reached a new level of intensity as the investigation progressed. Robert Mitchell's insurance office was broken into twice, though nothing appeared to be stolen. Nancy Brooks found that her apartment had been searched while she was at work, with furniture moved slightly and personal papers disturbed. The message was clear. The Men in Black organization could reach the witnesses anywhere and at any time. Dr. William Foster, the physicist who had provided James with information about Men in Black visits to government facilities, was transferred to a remote research station in Alaska with only 3 days' notice. His new assignment effectively ended his ability to continue providing information about the mysterious agents. Before leaving, Foster warned James that their conversations had likely been monitored and that continuing the investigation could be dangerous. The evidence collected by James, Betty, and David painted a picture of a shadow organization operating within the government with the purpose of suppressing UFO reports through intimidation and surveillance. The Men in Black had access to official vehicles, authentic identification cards, classified databases, and sophisticated surveillance equipment. They operated across state lines without interference from local law enforcement and received protection from federal prosecution. The financial trail suggested that the operation was funded through a combination of government black budgets and defense contractor resources. The systematic nature of the harassment indicated professional training and coordination. The protection from media exposure and legal consequences pointed to support from high-ranking officials within the intelligence community. James realized that he and his fellow investigators had uncovered evidence of what appeared to be an illegal domestic surveillance program targeting American citizens based solely on their reports of unusual aerial phenomena. Whether the program was authorized by secret executive orders or represented a rogue operation within the government remained unclear. but its existence could no longer be denied. By the winter of 1970, the investigation into the men in black had reached a dangerous standstill. Despite months of careful research and documentation, James Parker, Betty Coleman, and David Walsh had been unable to identify the specific individuals or agencies responsible for the mysterious agents. More troubling, several of the original witnesses had begun disappearing or withdrawing from public life entirely. Linda Hayes was the first to vanish from the investigation. The elementary school teacher from Tucson simply stopped returning phone calls and letters from other witnesses and investigators. When James drove to Arizona to check on her welfare, he discovered that Linda had resigned from her teaching position without notice and moved away without leaving a forwarding address. Her landlord said that two men in suits had visited Linda the week before she disappeared, though he could not provide any details about their conversation. The school principal where Linda had worked told James that she had seemed frightened during her final days at the school. Linda had asked about the procedures for changing her name and obtaining new identification documents. She had also inquired about teaching positions in other states, particularly locations far from Arizona. Her colleagues described her as paranoid and constantly looking over her shoulder, as if she expected to be followed. Mark Johnson, the rancher from Albuquerque, took a different approach to the escalating pressure. Rather than disappear, he sold his ranch and moved his family to a small town in Montana, where he hoped to escape the attention of the men in black. Before leaving New Mexico, Mark burned all of his documents related to his UFO sighting and destroyed any evidence that might connect him to the investigation. Mark's departure was sudden and final. He told James that the harassment had become unbearable and that he feared for his family's safety. Strange vehicles continued to appear on his property, and his wife had begun receiving threatening phone calls. Mark's cattle had been found dead, under mysterious circumstances, with no obvious cause of death. Veterinary examinations revealed no signs of disease or injury, but the animals appeared to have died from extreme stress or fear. Robert Mitchell attempted to maintain his normal life in Cedar Rapids, but the psychological pressure was taking a toll on his family. His wife Martha had become increasingly anxious about the unexplained phone calls and surveillance. Their children began having nightmares and were afraid to play outside. Robert's business suffered as clients noticed his distracted behavior and constant nervousness. The breaking point came when Robert's teenage daughter Jennifer was followed home from school by a black sedan. The car stayed behind her for several blocks before turning away, but Jennifer was terrified by the experience. That evening, Robert made the decision to stop all cooperation with the investigation and to never speak publicly about his UFO encounter again. He destroyed all correspondence with other witnesses and refused to answer questions from researchers. Nancy Brooks chose a middle path between complete disappearance and continued resistance. The nurse from Phoenix obtained a transfer to a hospital in Denver, hoping that relocating to a different state might reduce the harassment. She changed her name legally from Nancy Brooks to Nancy Wilson and took steps to minimize her public profile. However, she maintained contact with James Parker through intermediaries and continued to provide information when possible. Nancy's relocation initially seemed successful. The surveillance and harassment decreased significantly after her move to Denver. She was able to return to a more normal life and even began practicing astronomy again, though she never returned to the desert locations where her original encounter had occurred. Nancy remained cautious about discussing UFOs, but occasionally shared her experiences with trusted friends in the medical community. James Parker faced the most direct pressure to abandon his investigation. His military pension was temporarily suspended pending a review of his activities since retirement. Government auditors appeared at his ranch to examine his tax records and business dealings. Local authorities received anonymous complaints about alleged violations of zoning regulations and environmental laws on his property. The pressure on James intensified when Carol, his wife of 25 years, asked him to choose between his investigation and his family. Carol had endured months of harassment, surveillance, and implied threats. She was exhausted by the constant stress and feared that James's research was putting their entire family in danger. Carol gave James an ultimatum: stop the investigation immediately or she would leave him and move to live with their daughter in California. Betty Coleman, the investigative journalist, found that her career was being systematically destroyed. The Denver Post terminated her employment after she refused to abandon the Men in Black story. Other newspapers and magazines refused to hire her, claiming that her reputation had been damaged by her association with UFO conspiracy theories. Several journalism awards she had previously received were quietly rescinded by the organizations that had granted them. Betty discovered that her professional references had been contacted by unknown individuals who provided negative information about her work and character. Potential employers were warned that hiring Betty could result in government investigation of their operations. The systematic campaign to destroy her career was more sophisticated than simple blacklisting, and suggested the involvement of professionals trained in character assassination techniques. David Walsh, the private investigator, experienced more direct threats than the other investigators. Someone broke into his Los Angeles office and destroyed files related to the Men in Black investigation. His car was vandalized repeatedly, and he received anonymous phone calls warning him to stop his research. When David hired security guards to protect his office, the guards were approached by men who claimed to be federal agents and were told to terminate their employment immediately. The final blow to David's investigation came when his private investigator license was suspended by the California Department of Consumer Affairs. The suspension was based on complaints from anonymous clients who claimed that David had conducted unauthorized surveillance and violated privacy laws. David was unable to identify the complainants or verify the validity of their accusations, but the license suspension effectively ended his ability to continue professional investigative work. By 1972, the original group of Men in Black investigators had been effectively neutralized through a combination of harassment, career destruction, and personal pressure. James Parker had reluctantly agreed to abandon his research to save his marriage. Betty Coleman had moved to Canada, where she worked as a freelance writer under a different name. David Walsh had opened a small security consulting business that avoided any connection to UFO investigations. The systematic dismantling of the investigation demonstrated the power and reach of the Men in Black organization. They had successfully silenced witnesses and investigators without resorting to obvious violence or illegal imprisonment. Instead, they had used psychological pressure, economic warfare, and social isolation to achieve their goals. The techniques were sophisticated and suggested professional training in counterintelligence and psychological operations. James Parker made one final attempt to preserve his research by compiling all of his findings into a comprehensive report that he planned to submit to congressional investigators. He documented over 200 cases of Men in Black encounters and provided evidence of the systematic harassment campaign against UFO witnesses. The report included financial records, witness testimonies, and photographic evidence that supported his conclusions about the shadow organization. However, James never had the opportunity to present his findings to Congress. On a cold February morning in 1973, he was found dead in his truck on a remote section of his ranch. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, though James had no history of heart problems and had passed a physical examination just 3 months earlier. Carol Parker questioned the medical examiner's findings but was told that further investigation would not be authorized. The night after James's funeral, his ranch house was burglarized. The thieves ignored valuable items like jewelry and electronics, focusing instead on James's office where he had kept his research files. All documents related to the Men in Black investigation were stolen, along with correspondence, photographs, and audio recordings of witness interviews. The local sheriff's department classified the break-in as a routine burglary, despite the unusual pattern of items taken. Carol Parker discovered that her husband had hidden copies of his most important research documents in a safety deposit box at a bank in Albuquerque. When she attempted to access the box several months later, she was told that the contents had been removed by federal agents with a court order. The bank was unable to provide copies of the court order or identify which agency had authorized the seizure. The deaths and disappearances continued throughout the 1970s. Several other UFO researchers who had been investigating Men in Black encounters died under suspicious circumstances. Dr. William Foster, the physicist who had provided information about visits to government facilities, was killed in a car accident in Alaska, under conditions that suggested mechanical failure rather than driver error. The accident occurred on a straight section of highway with good visibility and no other traffic. Betty Coleman attempted to revive the investigation in the late 1970s by contacting surviving witnesses and trying to reconstruct James Parker's research. She discovered that many of the original witnesses had changed their identities or moved to remote locations where they hoped to avoid detection. Those who agreed to speak with her reported that the Men in Black visits had stopped abruptly, around 1973, as if the operation had been suspended or transferred to different personnel. The sudden cessation of Men in Black activities raised new questions about the nature and purpose of the operation. Some researchers theorized that the program had achieved its goals of silencing UFO witnesses and had been discontinued. Others suggested that the operation had evolved into more subtle forms of surveillance and intimidation that were harder to detect and document. Nancy Wilson, formerly Nancy Brooks, maintained occasional contact with UFO researchers throughout the 1980s and 1990s. She reported that she never experienced further harassment after her relocation to Denver, but she remained cautious about discussing her experiences publicly. Nancy observed that UFO reports continued to be made, but witnesses seemed less likely to discuss their encounters openly or seek publicity for their sightings. The Men in Black phenomenon persisted in UFO literature and popular culture, but serious investigation of the actual encounters became increasingly difficult. New witnesses reported visits from mysterious agents, but researchers found it nearly impossible to verify their accounts or trace the activities of the alleged agents. The climate of fear and intimidation created by the original campaign had lasting effects on the UFO research community. Modern UFO investigators studying historical Men in Black cases have found that most of the original witnesses are either dead or unwilling to discuss their experiences. Government agencies continue to deny any knowledge of the mysterious agents, and Freedom of Information Act requests have produced no documents acknowledging the existence of such an operation. The official position remains that the Men in Black encounters were either hoaxes or misidentifications of legitimate government personnel. The truth about the Men in Black organization died with James Parker and the other investigators who had come closest to uncovering their identity and purpose. The systematic destruction of evidence and the elimination of witnesses ensured that future researchers would find only fragments of the larger picture. The Men in Black had succeeded in creating a mystery that would persist for decades while protecting the secrets they had been created to guard. Today, more than 50 years after the original encounters, the Men in Black remain one of the most intriguing and troubling aspects of UFO phenomena. Their brief but intense campaign of witness intimidation demonstrated the existence of a shadow organization with significant resources and government connections. Whether they represented an authorized program or a rogue operation within the intelligence community may never be known, but their impact on UFO research and witness testimony continues to influence how people report and discuss unusual aerial encounters.